Welcome to the Disinfo Detox, where we cut through the noise to bring you the stories that matter. Today, we're diving into a crisis you won't hear much about on the evening news. News deserts. That's communities left in the dark as local journalism dries up. But in Martinez, California, one journalist is fighting back. Craig Lazzeretti saw the void left by shrinking newsrooms and took action, launching a Substack dedicated to uncovering the environmental, health, economic, and political damage caused by some of the local refineries in Martinez, California. Today, Craig joins us to talk about his mission to end the drought in his hometown's news coverage and why local journalism is more vital than ever. Craig Lazzeretti, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks for having me, Nolan. It's a pleasure.
Before we discuss your recent work on Substack, why don't you tell us how you got into journalism?
Yeah, well, it goes back to high school, back in the days when the newspapers were still a big deal in our society, and pretty much every high school had its own high school newspaper. So I was a big sports fan as a kid, so I loved reading the sports pages, even when I was in elementary or junior high school, following the local Bay Area teams. And then when I got into high school, I took a journalism class, fell in love with writing, the whole process of putting a newspaper together, and it just kind of took off from there. I wanted to decide to go into journalism in college and majored in journalism, but I also back then we had thriving local newspapers everywhere that had very significant resources at their disposal and lots of staff to cover everything under the sun in particular communities. And they were always looking for extra help, especially covering high school sports events during the high school seasons, and they were always looking for what we called stringers and journalism lingo. And so it was kind of easy to, if you were interested and had some basic writing skills and knew some basic journalism principles, to catch on. So I was able to catch on with my local newspaper, the West County Times, which was an offshoot of the Contra Costa Times at the time, and kind of worked my way through high school, well, through college. But actually, I even did a little work for them when I was in high school still, and it just kind of went from there. And graduated from San Francisco State University, landed a job at the Contra Costa Times in the early 90s, and stood there for about 30 years in a number of roles, starting out in sports, but then going into business journalism, and then spending the last portion of my career on the news side, metro coverage, covering local cities and communities, city hall type stories, school boards, you name it, everything to do with government.
We're here today talking about news deserts, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about how the industry has changed. So you talked about how there were more of these local papers, and as I was doing some research for the show, I found out that as of 2024, about 206 counties in the United States have no local news source, and nearly 1,600 only have one local source. So this means about 55 of the 330 million people in the United States have limited or no access to local news. You've sort of spanned that time. You've worked in this era when there was local journalism. You've gone through the rise of the digital environment, and here we are now. As someone who was watching these transitions, can you kind of explain just how the industry changed in the last, say, 20 or 30 years while you were a part of it?
Yeah, the change has been immense, and it's been sad because of the decline. Even when I was a young journalist starting out, newspapers still kind of struggled to find their footprint at times because they had to compete against television, radio. And so a lot of people, over the years had gravitated toward other mediums for their news content. But there was always a very kind of dedicated, entrenched newspaper readership that loved the intensive coverage of issues, both at the national, international, and local level, which you could get in your local newspaper. I mean, when I was a kid and a young adult, the Bay Area had no shortage of newspapers, metro newspapers, of every scope, from the big metros like the Chronicle, the old Examiner, who basically covered the Bay Area as a whole and covered national news, but also would cover local news throughout the Bay Area, to very kind of hyper local, intensive community papers, some weekly, some dailies, that would focus much more on community news, what was happening in individual cities and towns, and even within those areas, sometimes you would have competition. I remember in the Contra Costa Times days, we had a number of satellite papers throughout the region, and some of them competed with other papers in those regions from other organizations, and so there was a healthy, thriving, news environment. And that pretty much started to wane in the mid 2000s. A lot of consolidation happened, and it did mirror the advent of the internet. And the internet really, not initially, it didn't really compete with newspapers in terms of news content. A lot of the news sites, and even just before social media, would piggyback on what newspapers were doing or use their content um, to kind of promote their readership and their footprint. But it was really the advertising side of things. I mean, advertising, especially classified advertising, help wanted advertising, really was the economic driver of newspapers. And when that started to really go away in a big way, it was lost to the internet platforms like Craigslist and such. Uh, that's when you really saw the economic struggles begin. And then you started to see more and more consolidation. Readership started to fall as more people were getting their news through other venues or even through social media, even though a lot of that wasn't very reliable. So it was kind of a perfect storm of elements that kind of coalesced to really hammer the newspaper industry. And it really started in a big way, I would say, about 20 years ago. And it's been really tough sledding ever since.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And something else that made me think of one of the things I always sort of replay in my head that I think was a critical part of that time you're talking about. Just to add to what you said, um, remember, in the early kind of era of the commercial internet, a lot of these newspapers were basically giving their content away for free. I don't think they really understood the threat that was there until it was too late. And I say too late because by that point, large chunks of the audience had become accustomed to the idea that news, which they thought was journalism, but we can talk about that difference in a second. But they thought the news was free. It's has no value. It's something you can just flip on a computer and access. And I also think that was a problem. What do you think about that in terms of the industry giving away so much content for free?
That definitely was an issue, and it was something that news organizations, kind of wrestled with and struggled with in different ways. I know the Wall Street Journal, for instance, was one of the early adopters of a paywall, and they seemed to be successful because they were kind of a niche publication in terms of their financial news expertise. But I think the reason newspapers initially, when the internet came along and they started launching internet sites in its infancy, gave away the content for free was, again, um, the economic model of newspapers long had been driven by advertising revenue. And at that point, advertising revenue was still strong, probably for the first, you had the dot com boom and bubble in the early 2000s where there was a lot of fallout and a lot of change. And the impact on the newspaper industry wasn't really clear at that time. I mean, a lot of these companies that burst onto the scene in the late 90s quickly disappeared. Newspapers seem to be hanging in there very well. And to the degree that newspapers would charge for their print products, a lot of that was to recoup their delivery costs, the cost of actually printing the paper and delivering the paper. It really wasn't the subscriptions were never really a moneymaker, a, a source of profit for newspapers. So in that sense, it kind of, I think, it was logical for initially for news organizations to see the internet as a way to give their content away for free, since they didn't have those underlying costs while still being able to leverage the advertising opportunities. But then it became more and more clear that the advertising opportunities were really drying up. They were losing them on the print side, and they weren't gaining them nearly fast enough on the digital side. So at that point, I think news organizations found themselves kind of caught in a catch-22, not knowing what to do, because at that point they had been giving away the digital content for so long, and there were so many other sources out there that were still giving away the content. And one, bit the bullet and created a paywall. In a lot of cases, there was still enough competition that readers could go other way to find other, to other platforms, other sources to find the same information. I mean, the newspaper industry, even when we near the end of my tenure with the East Bay Times, which was basically how the Contra Costa Times evolved during multiple mergers and consolidations with the other Bay Area dailies. Uh, the bottom line was a lot of the breaking news content that we were producing, readers could still get that for free on the television sites, through the Bay Area media television sites or radio sites. And even to this day, I mean, none of those have implemented paywalls the way newspapers have. So it's not really surprising in a lot of ways that the paywall experiment has been so challenging. I mean, there definitely, I think, has been opportunities. I think the New York Times and some probably more so than anyone else, and to a certain extent, some other papers like the Washington Post and the Washington, the big national dailies have found a niche with paywalls because of the uniqueness of their content, the depth of their content. But for the average reader, it's kind of hard still to convince yourself to want to pay for a subscription to a news organization if you're not really convinced that the payoff is going to be, content that you can't find elsewhere for free. It's really kind of a problem without an easy answer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's shift gears then and talk about the work you're doing now, which I said at the top of the show, and I mean this. It's really critically important. I've studied media, been a part of media my whole life. In fact, you and I were contemporaries. While you were working as a journalist at the Contra Costa Times, I was a paper boy. But,
Back
but
when there was such a thing. Yeah.
exactly,
Long
get up
gone
there,
those days.
wrap the papers. Yeah. Um, but as I've gone through the work, we've talked a lot about news deserts and the importance of journalism for local communities. But the events with the refineries, which have kind of spanned your Substack career, which is what I want you to talk about. It was a real wake up for me about the realization of what it meant to live in a news desert. We were terrified for our health, what it may have been the impact on the health of the local community, the economic impact local community. And there just weren't a lot of answers. As you pointed out, the East Bay Times is supposed to cover the quote unquote East Bay, but really they kind of stick to the big cities in the Bay Area, and everywhere else is mostly treated as a news desert. So do you want to talk a little bit about what motivated you to start writing this Substack and how the kind of events of the refinery played a role in that?
Sure. It was kind of interesting, the timing, because I had thought about the idea of trying to create a newsletter or some kind of news platform in Martinez for a couple of years. I've lived here since the late '90s, and uh, beyond between the East Bay Times kind of pulling back in a major way from local coverage of Contra Costa County cities, especially suburban cities like Martinez, and then losing the closure of our long time, over 100-year-old weekly newspaper, the Gazette, that had been around for a long time, for generations and generations. Um, I really saw that Martinez wasn't really getting any real coverage, and we had a very high-profile election in 2022 when we were electing our first new mayor in 20 years, and there was a very crowded field. And I felt like, well, if I'm going to do it, now's the time to do it, because this is a real important election, and there's really no outlet for people to receive basic information, basic news coverage of the election, what the candidates are saying, doing, cutting beyond or cutting through the campaign advertising and the kind of allegations and claims on both sides, and to try to really sift through and provide some context for what voters were facing. So it was really well received during that period, and I thought it would just last through the election, and I would start it up again in a couple of years when we had another election. But it was so well received, I thought I would, keep it going as a news platform, an ongoing newsletter covering city news, largely city government, but also school board, other issues, topics. And then the big refinery spent catalyst release happened about a month after the election, even before our new mayor had been sworn in. And there was a lot of fallout from that and a lot of uncertainty about the magnitude, the significance, the health impacts. And there was a lot of discussion happening initially at city council meetings, but there wasn't a lot in the digital town hall. So we had a big online town hall a few weeks after the accident. But the information I could tell really wasn't sifting through to a lot of regular residents because there was no real news outlet that they knew of to turn to. I mean, my newsletter had gained a following through the election, but nevertheless, I still had a limited footprint. The average resident wasn't a subscriber, didn't know about it. And so a lot of residents were like asking questions about things, about topics that were being addressed in detail at city council meetings, but there was really no one there at the city council meetings to report in a broad way about what was going on. So the city was really struggling to get the word out to its residents through its own platforms. And so the newsletter was able to kind of, I think, to some degree at that point, and I think it's continued to grow in the couple of years since to fill that gap. And there were a lot of, as the investigations went on, as information slowly started to trickle out about the potential health impacts, what went wrong, then other incidents happened. There definitely was a need for a steady stream of coverage, I thought, to put everything into context and to kind of connect the dots, because steadily as the issues became more pressing and more residents became engaged with the issue, there was more media coverage. I mean, the San Francisco Chronicle did come in and do some stories. The television stations did some stories. Even the LA Times came in, the East Bay Times did some stories. But the problem was that when you have news platforms, news organizations that get to the point where instead of providing thorough daily coverage of issues in the community, they're parachuting in and out. When something big happens, and then they drop in, do some coverage, and a lot of times, unfortunately, the coverage lacks context, lacks the level of perspective and depth that you can only get if you're actually following an issue on a regular, consistent basis. But the average reader who is not used to getting news about Martinez in the San Francisco Chronicle anymore, or the East Bay Times, or you have it, they don't know to go to those outlets anymore. They don't know when those outlets are going to parachute in. So in some ways, what they're doing is more um, appealing to a broader audience outside Martinez, say, who still follows them on a regional basis, these platforms, and are curious, oh, what's happening in this city where they have this big refinery, as opposed to the information that's really valuable to people who live in the city itself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I think it's important for readers to know, or sorry, listeners to know this about your readers. I mean, at least from what I've seen online, you tell me. It seems like you've increasingly grown in popularity, especially locally. And I know there was another refinery incident, almost about 4.5 years later, just happened. That you also covered, and for most of I think the locals, you ended up being kind of the go-to place. Like we were waiting for Craig Lazzeretti to cover it, So you've already kind of, I think, established yourself somewhat of that position locally. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like covering that recent instance? What was some of your reporting was like, and what sort of response you got?
Yeah, that's interesting. It actually happened a little over 2 years, just slightly over 2 years since the spent callus release. And this was a major fire that was uncontrolled for about 7 hours. It was a very scary situation. It ultimately caused a shelter in place alert through the community warning system and county health authorities. And it really hit home for me because I'm a neighbor of the refinery. I can see the refinery from my driveway. That day, I could see the black smoke pouring out of the refinery during the fire from my driveway in my neighborhood. And when it initially happened and the alerts started going out, I basically, there was a lot of media attention from the TV stations and the news organizations because there were press conferences going on and statements going out. And so basically, what I tried to do for my readers, and then that's the benefit of the Substack or having a newsletter platform, because you have subscribers who subscribe to you through email, so you have the ability to put out alerts and content that's immediately emailed out to every one of your subscribers and ends up in their email box, and so that they can get it immediately as opposed to the average resident maybe having to search around and go to different sites. Um, Initially, I was just trying to follow what the public authorities were putting out. And the city was doing a good job, and the county was doing a good job in terms of updating their websites, putting out live video feeds with statements from different officials. I think there was at one point they were doing press briefings, updates every half hour that were being live streamed through different platforms, including the refineries platforms, which was helpful. Um, but I think the thing I was able to do or tried to do in the days that followed, I mean, I tried to keep people up to date on developments as they occurred. But I think again, where for a lot of the media, sometimes this is treated as a breaking news story that kind of begins and ends on that day. For me as a newsletter writer covering being a part of the community and covering the issue in my community, what happens on the day of the event is really just the beginning of the journalistic process to get to the bottom of what happened, why it happened, what the fallout is, what questions are being raised. So, immediately there's meetings that are occurring in the days that follow, a county supervisor, board of supervisors meeting, a city council meeting. Officials are showing up, answering questions, making comments, asking for help. Residents expressing frustration about the situation or how this could happen again. But also legitimate questions being raised, like why isn't more information available about where the fire originated in the refinery, what the possible causes could be. Why is that so slow to come out? Questions about the community warning system. Were county officials too slow to elevate the um, the warning to a shelter in place? Because for the first couple hours, it was what was called a level 2 warning, which is basically just a cautionary advisory for people who have respiratory sensitivity, such as asthma, to remain indoors. But everyone else um, was theoretically fine to be outdoors, outside as the fire was going on. But as the fire got worse and worse, and some of the efforts to cool the fire caused the smoke to come lower down to the ground and hover more over residential areas, they elevated that to a level 3 where they advised a shelter in place across the board. But there were some questions, and I don't think we have answers yet about whether it should have been a level 3 from the beginning, because this was an out of control fire that the refinery and the first responders had no control over whatsoever, and there was no way to know at what moment the wind direction might shift. So those are the kind of questions and these were the kind of questions that came out of the other incidents that I was able to kind of follow up on and address, and kind of look into some of the, put some context into what was actually going on. They were doing a major turnaround project, which is a major turnaround is kind of refinery lingo for a huge overhaul maintenance project where they shut down particular units and do major upgrades. And they were trying to do major upgrades. This was, I knew from past reporting and from past presentations that the refinery had been given to the city council. This was going to be one of the biggest turnarounds in the history of the refinery. And they were doing a major upgrade project of one of the units to bring into compliance with a new air district rule to reduce their emissions significantly. So those are the kind of contexts that you only can have if you're following an issue on an ongoing basis over a significant amount of time. And so that's why I feel like, I wasn't necessarily going to be there on the scene, with the camera crews, with microphones and cameras, and with the great visuals of the refinery smoke on the day it was happening. I do my best to keep people posted on what's going on, how significant it is, put it in context. But then I feel like my work as a newsletter writer really kicks in uh, when the fire is actually out, and then the investigation, the questions start.
Yeah, and I agree. And I'm glad you point that out because I think people often do get kind of enamored with like these big like legacy media outlets when they come to a small town because they're getting some attention finally. But as you point out, there's no replacement for that local context. Like I'm sure people watching in like places like East Palestine and stuff, places like that would absolutely agree with what you're saying. I also wanted to ask, you've talked about your career here, which spans a lot of critical changes in journalism, and Substack seems to be a recent, more popular trend for a lot of writers, and I see you're obviously there as well. So, what about like younger folks who are thinking about possibly getting into journalism, or younger folks who've just gotten into journalism? Given your experiences and kind of where you've seen the industry go, what might be some advice that you would give to folks who are just starting out their careers or thinking about getting into journalism as a career?
Yeah, that's a good one because it's really a lot tougher than it was when I was starting out. The opportunities are not nearly as vast. Uh, but on the other hand, you know, the need for in-depth reporting on issues that really provide a level of context and thoughtfulness is probably more important than ever because one of the unfortunate realities of the shift of the news media to a internet based format is that there's so much focus on page views and clicks and what kind of stories and headlines can get people to click as opposed to in the old days when you were a newspaper you had no way of knowing what readers were reading what articles in the
Mm.
paper. It was just delivered to their doorstep, and what they read. There were no metrics, and so there wasn't enough. You definitely wanted to put compelling stories that would keep people interested because otherwise you might lose their subscriptions. um, but I think it was a very different dynamic. But I think it's so important in this day and age to really have people who show a level of curiosity, uh, a level of interest in the complexity of topics, because sometimes a lot of uh, our quick hit news environment where people are just bouncing from story to story to story lacks that, lacks the complexity and lacks the ability to really dig deeper into an issue. And we live in a society that tries to see so many issues in black and white terms when the reality is so much more complicated. And so on most topics, and I think that's been true even in the refinery coverage. I think that I've tried, as I've covered the refinery incidents, I've tried to distinguish or put context into what incidents were more significant than others, what incidents really raise major health concerns versus others. The overall culture of the refinery, those kind of things. Whereas I think that a lot of the outside media that would just parachute in, okay, something went wrong. Let's put out a juicy headline, which is going to scare the residents of Martinez again, but it's going to give us a lot of clicks, and then we're going to move on. And so I think my advice would be that if you want to go into journalism, there's a big temptation to gravitate toward that business model, that corporate media business model that's driving journalism now, and is driving in a way that I think is not helpful for what we need as a society to be really well informed. But at the same time, there are outlets and organizations and platforms that really do want to provide that service, and you can be part of that, and you can be an important part of kind of shaping the future, because I think we're really at a major kind of turning point or tipping point in journalism, where we're really going to have to figure out. I think the industry is going to have to figure out where it goes from here, and how much of its focus is going to be on clicks, page views, and ultimately revenue generation versus really trying to serve the public interest. And it used to be that those things just more naturally went hand in hand, and that's not so much the case anymore. Um, so, there's a lot of nonprofit efforts, initiatives underway to try to fill that vacuum. And I think those are really, worthwhile things to look at. There's a lot of experimentation on platforms like Substack with young journalists that I've seen. So really, try to experiment, try to uh, look beyond the surface of a particular topic or issue, and really get to the bottom of what's driving these debates, these conflicts, these problems. And then you'll find, I think, opportunities to find your niche that way.
When you're saying that, makes me think of something else I always think about on a personal level too, which is, like you said, in the short term, it's so easy to go for that kind of fast clicks, sensationalistic headlines content. It'll get you the attention that the digital economy thinks is valuable. But that's only in the short term. I think in the long term, a lot of those folks end up losing credibility. And I wonder if, as we wrap up here, if you can kind of just speak to, as a journalist, like how important it is to have those principles you're talking about letting the story guide you, having that curiosity, following the facts, asking the right questions. When you do that consistently, and audiences notice, I think that transitions into credibility, which I would argue is probably the most important aspect that you look for in a journalist. Is, are they giving it to me straight? Is this someone I can trust? Can you talk a little bit about that, about credibility for journalists, specifically for young journalists thinking about getting into the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, one thing as journalists, and I'm sure you've dealt with this, uh, that we struggle with is always a challenge, is to kind of build that trust. There's always that crossing that barrier when you're dealing with sources, when you're dealing with, whether it's government officials or industry officials. Whether they really trust you to at least try to get it straight or get it right, to do your best to get it right, to do your best to get it fair. And if they know you're really playing straight with them and you're doing your best to be fair, they're more likely to work with you, even when the news you're reporting isn't necessarily to their advantage. Like with my newsletter, I call it Martinez News and Views. It's probably 80 to 90% news, but I do sprinkle with views, and sometimes some of the views I share can be kind of hard hitting in terms of people I deal with on a regular basis in town. But I found that local officials, even people in the industry, um, they know that I'm trying to be fair. I'm trying to get both sides. They know as a citizen, I'll go to city council meetings and school board meetings, and I'll express my points of views, and I'll express my points of views in a very sharp manner, because I'm a member of this community and I have a stake in what happens. But they know when I go to write it up, I'm going to present both sides, and I'm going to not try to shove my own views down people's throats. And I think that's kind of helped me with my credibility. But I don't want to speak for them; they can speak for themselves. But I think that being outside daily journalism, you kind of have a different perspective, and you can step outside. Like with any industry, I think when you're in law enforcement, say, and you're a cop your whole life, you see things a certain way, and you can be very entrenched in the culture of your line of work and the idea of what's right and wrong. But when you're actually out of that, you can step back a little bit and see maybe a bigger picture. Well, that's kind of been true for me with journalism. And I've been able to kind of see too, as I've been away from daily journalism, I could kind of, relate or understand a little bit more about why sometimes people were frustrated with how we went about our business because they felt like, we had at times, you know, whether it was a profit motive, driven motive, or just in terms of trying to get the juiciest story, we can, trying to play gotcha, you know, um, those are all things that you kind of encounter when you're dealing in the business. And part of it's just kind of the beast. You have a different role than they have, right? So you're going to clash sometimes, and there's always not going to be a situation where every time someone's right or someone's wrong. And a lot of the times, the backlash I got in daily journalism, I felt was unwarranted or unjustified. And I still feel that way, but at least I can kind of understand their perspective a little better now, because I've had some of the same frustrations being outside of daily journalism and seeing how the refinery issues were covered and feeling like at times they were covered without the context they needed, the depth, the perspective that sometimes the outside media was trying too hard to be as inflammatory as possible to get clicks. Which, maybe if I was in that situation, in that role, not knowing the context, not knowing all the facts, not
Mhm.
knowing the intricacies of these issues, it would be easy for me just to put out the most click-worthy headline there. But then sometimes you can stoke unwarranted fear in your community too, and so you have to really. Sometimes I feel like corporate-driven local journalism, to the extent that it exists, from run by organizations that aren't part of the community, that aren't tied into the community. It's almost like they're designed to prey on the community's pain and struggles. And then when they've gotten their clicks, they move on. And so in the old days, when you had journalism organizations that were immersed in the community, that were part of the community, they would cover the news, good, bad, or ugly, but you knew they were part of the community. They didn't have a particular agenda, or you knew that they cared about the community at its core. And so they were going to cover the bad stuff, but they were also going to cover the bad stuff in a way to try to make things better, right? And to kind of get to the bottom of issues and affect change. And I think that that's kind of to the degree that we still have some level of local journalism when it's not really locally based, that's where you struggle to have a situation where the local journalism is really serving the interests of the people who live there.
Gosh, well, Craig, I'm gonna have to have you back on again. There's so much stuff to talk to you about. Why don't you remind our listeners where they can access your work and follow you if they want to?
Right. Well, the easiest thing is if you just want to go Google Martinez News and Views, you should be able to find my newsletter, my website. And you can subscribe there, and you'll get all my posts. And it's martinezNewsandViews.substack.com if you want to go there directly. I appreciate any support that people offer. I have built up a strong core of paid subscribers and donors, and that allows me to hire freelance writers to supplement what I'm able to do and provide more coverage. So, if you're able to provide if you're willing or able to purchase a paid subscription, it's much appreciated. But most of the content I put out, especially for on issues I think are of core importance to the community and their daily lives, I put out for free. And yeah, and thanks for the interest and thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening to the Disinfo Detox. This has been a very special episode. I want to thank Craig Lazzeretti again for coming on the program. And thank you for tuning in. Please make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things those digital tech lords love.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Disinfo Detox wherever you get your podcasts. Detox complete.